Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to this. This is actually our last episode of the series, so
I know, I'm excited. I
crazy.
need to catch up. I've not gotten a chance to plug in on the other ones. They've been on my list, but that's what I'm gonna do. I'm definitely listening to my episode, but I'll listen to the
Yeah,
others too.
that would be fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate all the work you do with the Young Dems and whatnot. And we're so glad that you said yes to being on our episode. So, with that being said, we're gonna start off with a quick pulse check. First question I'm gonna ask you is, tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in politics.
So I'm originally an East Texan. I live in Odessa, which I um, lovingly refer to as the elbow of Texas because we hug New Mexico. But I'm originally from Tyler, Texas, and then I went to the University of North Texas on the northern part of the state and spent a brief time working in the Texas legislature during my senior year of college, and then made it out west kind of by accident, but found myself in a wild political community that I just couldn't bear to leave. My day job is as an advocate for a nonprofit that serves adult survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And there's a lot more politics and a lot more media and communication and development that crosses over between that role and all of my political roles than I think people expect. So I wear those hats pretty much all day, every day, just for different organizations. So I'm also the county chair in Ector County, which is the county that houses my beloved Odessa. And it's been a really interesting ride to be a county chair and to have a hand in representing basically the local version of the Democratic Party. So I come from a very informal background when it comes to politics. I've always been more of an organizer and an advocate than any sort of like professional political junkie, but I found this home with the Texas Young Democrats, and it's led me to all sorts of really interesting places, including here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. I lived in Texas for 7 years myself, and I hear about my state in the news all the time, especially as of recent. And I want you to explain to our audience what's happening in Texas right now and why it's so special, why this instance people should care about more.
So Texas politics feels like since I've been maybe a teenager, that really has become always adjacent to the national stage. Like if we're not in trouble somehow as a state, then there's some faction of Texas politics that is getting some level of national attention, whether that's lawsuits, whether it is legislation that's being passed, a whole litany of things. But the thing that has brought us to the national stage right now is the quorum break. And so this is only one of only a handful of quorum breaks that have ever happened in the history of the Texas legislature. And to kind of explain what that looks like is that we have to have a minimum number of legislators present in either body of our Texas legislature, either the House or the Texas Senate. And if we don't meet that minimum number of legislators, they can't pass laws, they can't have a formal meeting of that body. They can have committee meetings, they can exist, but there's very little actual legislating that happens. And so as we speak right now, there's a substantial portion of the Texas House in particular, but also members of the Texas Senate who have made their way to DC. And they've been there since July 12th, when they left the state on chartered flights, basically to get them out of the hands of Texas leadership. And once they left the state and refused to engage with the legislative process as a means of preventing legislation that they think is going to be harmful to people, we've stopped that legislation from passing specifically out of the House because unfortunately we don't have quite enough folks gone from the Texas Senate to stop legislation from moving from the Senate, but House members and Senate members are in DC lobbying our members of Congress, lobbying members of Congress like Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and others to work on things like passing civil rights legislation, passing legislation that protects voting rights, and then making sure that our national representation is working to prevent the sort of policies that are going to harm voters that are going to come out of the state of Texas.
What does the current Texas legislation composition look like? You know, if you look at the split between Republican and Democrats, independents, et cetera, what does that look like between the House and the Senate?
So the Texas legislature mirrors our national system. It's a bicameral legislature. We have the Texas House of Representatives and then the Texas Senate. So the Texas House has 150 members, and that majority is held by the Republican Party. They have a 9-vote majority, and that allows for them to have a lot of control over what legislation gets passed. Though if you look down at the committee level, one of the interesting things that comes out of the Texas legislature is that even though we've been in Republican control for effectively my entire life, we do still see Democrats with committee chairmanships, co-chairmanships, those sorts of things. So there are elements of Democratic leadership, but overall, the Republicans have a majority in the House, and they maintain our speakership, and they have for decades. And then when you flip over and look at the Senate side, we have 31 Senate districts. Ironically, some of those Senate districts are so large because Texas is such a huge state that some of those Senate districts are bigger than entire members of Congress's districts in other states. So if you look at a small state with a couple of congressional districts, their constituencies are actually smaller than some of these Texas Senate districts. They are enormous. Mine travels hundreds of miles north of me, and I couldn't drive across it in less than 5 hours. But that body is made up of 31 members, and just like the House, it has a majority of Republicans, and it also has Republican leadership that's managed by the state's lieutenant governor. So that's a national or a statewide elected position that is also held by a Republican.
Well, going back to a previous question, you mentioned that the Texas Democrats are in DC. That's a pretty big deal, doing all that work lobbying for all this great legislation. What would you say the tipping point for them was?
Really, that tipping point, what was kind of the impetus behind that July 12th exit, was what Democrats would call the voter suppression bill. So the Republicans are framing it more as an election integrity push, but across the left and even in parts of the middle of the political divide, we're seeing a lot more language leaning towards voter suppression. And that bill, which is in the Senate, it's SB1, and in the House, it's House Bill 3, is a piece of legislation that is going to add additional, in almost all cases, add additional restrictions to voting access in the state of Texas. So it has to do a lot with partisan poll watchers, dates and times in particular of early voting, whether or not you can drive through vote or vote in your car, those kinds of parameters, things that just impact regular voting practices. And we're adding those provisions to what is arguably the hardest state's set of rules to vote in. So under Texas law as it is, Texas is widely categorized as one of the strictest set of voting laws. And now this is an additional layer. So on the 11th of July, that bill passed out of a special committee that was formed for this session for the House. And a number of legislators met and heard the bill late into the evening. An 8 a.m. Bill hearing lasted well after midnight with lots and lots of folks testifying. And after that passed, that next day is the day that the legislators left. So we had this really suppression heavy focus, especially from a left perspective, coming into this session, looking at only 11 categories of legislation as outlined by the governor when he set up our special session. And with this one being such a big focus for Democrats with so many concerns about limiting access to voting, that was just the final straw.
Yeah, for sure. That's very interesting. And you touched on this briefly in your discussion of what happened, but what are the key talking points of each side?
So I'll start with the Republicans, and I will couch this with the fact that I am solidly a Democrat. I'm a Democratic Party official in that I represent my county as a Democratic Party official. I'm also the head of the youth caucus of the Texas Democratic Party. So I will say, take it with a grain of salt, but the governor has really come forward and said, our big focus is election integrity. They are pushing it from protecting the state from voter fraud. We have an attorney general who has an entire division of his office that is dedicated to hunting down voter fraud. And they haven't found substantial voter fraud, but they're arguing not that there is substantial fraud that needs to be remedied, but that there is potential for fraud that needs to be prevented. So a lot of these legislative efforts mirror a lot of work that's happening in other states after the 2020 election. But frankly, in a lot of cases, they are specifically looking to end practices that were done in counties like Harris County in this last election cycle. So their real focus is preventing fraud. They want to make sure voting is secure, is the language that they're using over and over again. And they want to make sure that these issues that they think are important, and it's not just voter fraud. The special session has a strict set of parameters in which we can legislate. The governor is required to give lists effectively of legislation that they focus on. And that was number 2 on the list, but that isn't limited to that. There are other items like bail reform and some instances of educational material that are being discussed. We can get into the critical race theory conversation. We can get into a conversation about some of the other things that are on there, but that was number 2 on the list. So it was really, really highly prioritized. And then from the left's perspective, so what lines up more with my personal interpretation of this session and specifically that bill is basically we are chasing a problem that doesn't exist. We are trying to legislate as a state the ability for people to vote, making it more difficult, making people have fewer hours that they can vote. We are making it so that there are more partisan folks with more power in the elections, where the elections are happening in polling centers, and a number of other issues, but really getting into what I would just strictly classify as voter suppression, making it harder for more Texans, especially low-income Texans, Texans of color, young Texans, making it harder for all of those groups to vote, rather than expanding access to Texas elections.
Hannah, you mentioned that the Republicans are trying to prevent what happened in Harris County. Can you elaborate on that and provide a little bit more details for us non-Texans who never heard of Harris County before?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So Harris County is home to Houston, which is the third or fourth largest, somebody can check me on that one, city in the United States. So there were some really innovative voting efforts that were put through from Harris County. For example, they had overnight voting during early voting, where there were polling locations that were open at 3 o'clock in the morning and all the way through, because in a place like Harris County, you have folks that work during sunlight hours, and the only time they can vote is in the middle of the night. And there were quite literally folks that voted in the middle of the night. They did drive-through voting as an effort to keep folks safe during COVID. And what's interesting about Harris County is that it's one of the only counties in Texas that's run across the board by Democrats. Their county judge is a Democrat. Their county clerk is a Democrat. They have lots and lots of left-leaning leadership. They're not the only ones, but they're certainly the largest county with left-leaning leadership. And they had all of these really, really innovative ideas that were attempting to make voting more accessible for folks in Houston and in the surrounding cities that are encompassed in Harris County. And they ran almost all of these, if not all, to my knowledge, of these procedures, including drive-through voting and including overnight voting, by the Texas Secretary of State, who is in charge of overseeing all of our elections. And the Secretary of State's office authorized all of these programs that came out of Houston. And yet, the same governor who appointed that Secretary of State, the same governor who is of the same party affiliation as the Secretary of State, is now using the special session as a means to legislate changes that include things like ending drive-through voting and making it harder to vote by mail and making it harder to vote. Instead of overnight voting, this new legislation looks at limiting voting between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. And I know plenty of folks who work from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. I live in an oil field community, know lots of folks who that's a pretty standard work day with overtime. And there are not a lot of flexible hours for them to go vote. And in my county, we don't even get 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. We get 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So you're SOL if you go into work at 6:30 or 7:30 in the morning and you work out of the county, or you work in a rural community or anywhere nearby, or even if you just work a 12-hour shift. It makes it really hard for folks to vote.
And then you mentioned how the right is viewing the election integrity and what they're trying to prevent and safeguard. You mentioned on the left, on the Democratic side, again, what they're trying to safeguard and protect. Anecdotally, what are you hearing on the street from people just like you? And also, Sohan, your family's from Texas, you live in Texas. Like, what are people talking about as the special session happens? And then particularly with like this election integrity piece, is it?
A lot of the folks I'm hearing from are just frustrated. There are people who in February didn't have power, didn't have water for days on end, myself included, who would have loved to see a special session that focused on fixing the grid. And like I said, I'm from an oil and gas area. The entire industry out here is energy. That's what funds my work. That's what keeps my city going. And it's really important to me. But part of the way that would have been beneficial to me and to my community is to make sure that our industry doesn't get blamed when we have a freak storm. Let's weatherize all these things. And so there's a lot of that conversation going on of why aren't we talking about the grid? Why aren't we talking about safeguarding Texans from natural disasters and from, frankly, just losing electricity in the heat of summer or in the peak of winter? Like, how can we keep Texans safe? So there's a lot of frustration there. And certainly I run in fairly left-leaning circles, and a lot of folks are frustrated that we even have a special session at all. We have a special session because the governor called one and because certain items were either vetoed or stalled out in our regular session, and they just didn't get finished, or they got rejected after they had been already finished. And now we're back to fight about this voting bill, which frankly, I'm not hearing a lot of support for on the ground. And often when I hear support, people are misconstruing what happens entirely. They're saying, of course, we should have, voter ID laws. And I have to remind people, this isn't about voter ID. This bill has nothing to do with adding voter ID. We added that years ago. We've had voter ID. So the folks that I'm hearing from that are advocating for it are advocating for it in a very partisan way, not necessarily a legislative way. But mostly a special session in the state of Texas costs more than $1 million to taxpayers. I would rather see $1 million go to any number of places personally, and so would a lot of the folks in the circles that I run in.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Hannah. I might not be the lifelong Texan that you are, but I have lived in Texas for quite a large portion of my life. I moved there in 2012, and I've lived there since I've lived there until 2019, and I've been in North Carolina since. But this year has been a constant state of embarrassment. When people ask me, what's your take on what's happening in Texas? And I say, it's just the same old thing, just with a lot more media attention. And the voter suppression bills, the anti-critical race theory bills, they're all part of the same vein. And it's interesting to see that the whole country is starting to pay attention to what we've been seeing for years and years. And that sort of leads me to another point. When I'm in Dallas, I see cranes everywhere. People are moving there in droves. And demographics are changing. People from the East Coast and West Coast want to take advantage of the cheaper cost of living and just have some of that Texas pride. But I haven't felt that politics have changed that much over the past 10 years. I haven't felt that growth has translated into better policies. What is your take on that?
It's been such an interesting shift to watch Texas politics in the past decade, because I think you're exactly right, is that we're seeing new Texans, we're seeing more young Texans. I mean, the demographics of the state are getting younger and more diverse with literally every passing day. And from a partisan perspective, I'm excited about that. Young Texans and Texans of color are more likely to support a lot of the issues that I support and that the organizations that I'm a part of support. But overall, we haven't seen a fundamental shift in power. In 2018, we saw a pretty substantial swing of the Texas House. We gained a lot of seats in 2018 that really brought us closer to a Democratic majority in the House than we've been, certainly in my memory. But overall, we haven't seen enough of a shift to really change anything. Like in 2020, we didn't gain a single seat in the House. We didn't gain a single congressional seat. We had some flip-flop, right? We had some we won, but then they were countered by another that we lost. So we kind of stalled in some ways in the past 12 months. But what I think is really interesting is this larger pattern of the House in particular. So I'm biased, I worked in the Texas House, but the Texas House has always been kind of an interesting character because if you look at governing bodies, the bigger they are, generally we can see bigger swings in partisanship. We think of senates as being the more measured, deliberative, mature bodies, because in our case, the Texas Senate has a 4-year term. So most of these folks have been in office for a long time. They represent really broad swaths of Texas. And in the House, they're represented by much smaller districts and they get elected every 2 years. So you'd expect to see some of those really strong partisan swings in an area. And I think we saw that with 2008 and 2010. We saw this big Tea Party movement come in. We saw the Texas Freedom Caucus, which is our right-wing caucus within the Texas House, really start to gain ground. And we've had some really, frankly, really wonderful, really measured, really intelligent leadership from both sides. But in particular, I've got to give props to the Republican leadership of the state of Texas in the past couple of decades. We've had some really wonderful speakers at the House, and we've had some folks who really just bring a level of like maturity and sanity to that body in a way that's kept it from being the wild ones, right? We had some really heated moments when I was in the legislature in 2017, a lot of fighting between the two bodies that hasn't really ever subsided. And it's been interesting to watch them go from being a little bit more moderated, a little bit more measured as a group, to slowly move to the right. And this session is such a good example of that shift because we have a speaker who in theory is fairly moderate. He's not right-wing. He's not a member of the Freedom Caucus. He is not a champion of right-wing, just wild legislation that's just outside of kind of the realm of the average voter. But there's so much turmoil within the Republican Party. There's a huge fight coming in our gubernatorial primary. There's a huge fight coming in our attorney general's primary between just your standard moderate George Bush Republicans and Trump Republicans and QAnon Republicans and folks, I mean, literally people who were at the insurrection on January 6th are kind of getting into this fray politically. And you see that more statewide narrative really starting to pull the body of the House and the Senate, and more so the House, because the Senate was already almost there, to the right and getting into this more suppression legislation and really getting into this weird, just non-Texan vibe. If you look at, so I'm going to kind of look back at our regular session for a second. If you look at the constitutional carry legislation that passed out of the state of Texas, the vast majority of Texans want people to have permits to carry guns, period. I want people to have permits to carry guns. My Republican next door neighbor wants people to have permits to carry guns. All sorts of folks across the board. Certainly as a domestic violence advocate, I want people to have permits. And yet we allowed this small right-wing subsection of the House to drive this legislation that 2 years ago, 4 years ago would never have passed. And now it's about to become law on September 1st. You will not have to have a license to open carry a weapon in the state of Texas. You can carry anything, and specifically handguns, because you've always been able to open carry long guns. But having that shift come now is such, I think, a great example of where our politics has changed.
Yeah, oftentimes these changes take time and it's a long process. And I remember back in November when my college classmates and I were watching the election, we were really looking at Texas. I remember
Absolutely.
being glued to CNN's coverage of the Texas results coming in. And I was going to ask you about what your take on 2020 was, the election in Texas, and what it revealed about the process.
I think after the 2018 election, folks were geared up for Texas to flip. I mean, we had a phenomenal narrative coming out of the left. Texas is the biggest battleground state. We are big. Oh, give us that. We're not quite to what a lot of people think of when they think of a swing state. I think when folks, especially young people, think of a swing state, we think of a state that's going to have a executive or statewide ticket that gets split by voters. And like you have the worst of the Republicans get flipped by Democrats and vice versa. And we see folks really start to pick based on race by race and not having entire tickets win like we saw in 2020. Obviously, Joe Biden got closer than any Democrat has gotten in a long time. He was closer than Beto O'Rourke, who was closer than the folks before him, and who was closer than the folks before them. We've seen some really steady growth. We saw really, really good statewide campaigns on the left do perform really, really well. We had a phenomenal candidate in 2018 for Senate with Beto O'Rourke in his statewide tour. We had a phenomenal candidate for Attorney General in 2018 who made real strides against our indicted Attorney General and got closer than really any other person on our statewide slate. And a really, really solid candidate for Lieutenant Governor doing exactly the same thing. And yet we weren't quite ready to flip. And 2020, I think, solidified for a lot of organizers and activists on both sides, but that Texas is still very much shifting. We're not shifted. We are not a state that is just one good candidate away from being blue. We are so close to seeing a major sea change in our politics, but there is so much voter suppression, there is so much gerrymandering, that all of those factors are really keeping us just shy of being what I would classify as a swing state. I think we're almost there. And 2020 for me really showed me, like, I'm kind of tying it back into Harris County, that we can see some really, really talented, creative individuals. Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo is the executive for Harris County. So she oversees Houston, she oversees all the counties that are all the cities that are encompassed within Harris County. And they found some really, really innovative solutions. And we've seen really, really great progress within that county. We've seen it get bluer and bluer and bluer up and down the ballot. And there's other counties that we're seeing the same sort of thing. But we're still, Texas is a really big state and it's still a really rural state. I live in a really, really rural part of the state. My nearest city, I would say, is like 2 hours away from me. And even then, we're talking about a city of 300,000 people. There are no million-person cities within a 5-hour drive of me. So it's interesting to kind of see that shift and see folks really expect all of Texas to look like those metroplexes, to look like Dallas, to look like Houston, to look like Austin, when an enormous portion of the state is, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, well, living in one swing state, calling another swing state home, I definitely feel that. And I want to transition to my next point. You mentioned the whole deal about voter suppression and gerrymandering. They're drawing the maps right now as we speak. That's a big deal for the next 10 years.
Absolutely.
What are the possible ways you think this could play out in Texas, for Texas, in terms of these voter suppression bills and the Democrats leaving to DC? What do you think how do you think this will play out for our state?
It's certainly interesting from a place that's not Austin. From my perspective, I am in a county that had population growth over the past 10 years, but I'm surrounded by counties that saw substantial drops in population. It's a hard industry to be in out here. But we're looking at seeing these 2 new congressional districts and potentially so much population shift from places like, I can't even think of a great example, but some of these rural counties that are nearby that have seen 10, 20% population drops over the last year, and kind of where those new districts are going to go. We've seen a couple of versions of the maps. There are some that do some really strange things, like put my district that has not been looped in with anything blue anytime recently, getting dragged into the district that is, let's see, I'm trying to think of, it's basically a district that's encompassed currently from El Paso all the way to San Antonio. So for my non-Texans, that's, depending on where you're coming from on the edge of the district, we're talking about 5 to 7 hours apart. And throwing West Texas, what we lovingly call the Permian Basin, right in the middle of all of that. And then seeing folks have these really, really massive districts because we have to accommodate all these urban centers that have had an enormous amount of growth. And they absolutely need more representation because they have so much growth. So I think where the lines are drawn is going to be really interesting. certainly from a rural perspective, but even to see where those districts kind of get plugged in, because our growth is really so widespread, how they readjust those lines. And frankly, because we should have gotten 3 districts. Almost all the metrics would indicate that Texas should have had a 3rd congressional district, but our census numbers weren't quite there. But as far as redistricting, I think you're exactly right. Having the Democrats be in DC is such a wild card that I don't think anyone anticipated for this redistricting fight. We have been having hearings for months on redistricting, on the census numbers, on the lines, on what communities should be together in which districts. And there are some really wild ones. If you look back historically, it's redistricting is actually something that caused the last major quorum break that happened in 2003. So it's not the first time we fought over maps at this level. But it's interesting, since the Democrats have pledged to be gone through the end of this 30-day special session. They have said, we're not coming back until the 2nd week of August, meaning they're not going to allow this session to pass anything out of the House, meaning it's not going to pass at all. But how able and willing are they to stick that out to interfere with the special sessions that will have to do with redistricting? Obviously, we don't have our full census numbers yet. We knew going into this summer, so our regular session ended on May 31st, and we knew not long after that we'd have at least one special session because we hadn't drawn maps yet. So now going into a conversation of that session that's supposed to be dedicated to drawing maps, we don't even know for sure we're going to have Democrats here to do that. So it's going to be really interesting. And I'm hesitant to make any really strong guesses because I know folks are probably ready to go home from the conversations I've had. There are certainly some folks that are already drained, I'm sure, by the drama of being away from families and the struggle of being away from, loved ones and work and all of those things. But as we finish out this election fight, which is not ending anytime soon, we're jumping right into a whole different iteration of it with those district maps. And so I think we'll see. If the Democrats are creative enough, we may actually be able to stall long enough to delay it an entire election cycle. But we'll see. That would take some real creativity on their part, things that I certainly haven't thought of.
So with the Democrats in DC, what is lost to the Texan people by not having this forum go on, people not meeting? Like, what is the net loss to Texan citizens with this stall?
I would say the biggest argument, certainly that's coming from kind of the middle right, is that they're not doing their jobs. That's not really the camp that I stand in, but there's certainly a number of folks who think you were elected to legislate, you should be in session. You should be, arguing these things out, debating, voting on legislation. Most of the Democrats I've heard are arguing that we are doing our job by stopping bad legislation. But certainly there are folks that don't care for that argument. They really just think that quorum break's not a tool. And it's a tool that's been used by both parties, not as often here. We've certainly seen it used more often by Democrats, certainly in my lifetime. But it's been used by Republicans in places like Oregon. And we don't hear about that as much because Oregon politics, frankly, isn't as full of fireworks as Texas politics is, that's for sure. But really, from my perspective, I mean, there are a handful of things that are on this special session slate that are being held hostage that we are missing out on. And I don't mean hostage by the Democrats. I specifically mean they were put in by the governor to make the Democrats stick around. And then the biggest of those, there are 2 that come to mind, but really the biggest of those is what's called Article 10 funding. And on September 1st, there will be no more funding for the staff of the Texas legislature. There's no funding for the legislators themselves. There's no funding for the parliamentarians, for the people who make the day-to-day of the House work, the day-to-day of the Senate work. All of those legislative employees had their paychecks defunded effectively when the governor line item vetoed. So specifically voted out one particular section rather than an entire portion of the budget. So he took the entire Texas budget for the 2-year term, because that's how we do our budgets, on a biennium basis. And he said there is no Article 10. And that means legislators don't get paid, which is his whole point. You don't show up, you don't get paid to do your jobs. But the fallout of that is Their staff don't get paid. The folks that make our legislature run don't get paid either. And there's a lot of questions about the constitutionality of that. Are we asking people to work but not pay them? There are a whole lot of questions that I certainly can't answer that we're going to see play out in lawsuits and a number of other places. But while the Democrats are gone, that article can't be added back into the budget. Just like we can't pass election security legislation, election integrity legislation, we also can't pass Article 10. So while they're gone, there are staff of both sides of the parties, both sides of the aisle, that are worried about their paychecks. I mean, these are people with mortgages. I mean, I was, fortunate to work in that job as a young person and have financial assistance as part of the program that put me in that job. But I know plenty of people whose literal livelihoods, their mortgages, their grocery bills, their cell phone bills, all of those rely on Article 10 funding. So that would be a really huge thing that's potentially on the chopping block as a result of their departure. And then the second side of that is there was a bill that was passed during our regular session. So the Texas legislature only meets for 140 days every odd numbered year, which is dumb. I'm glad, not uncomfortable saying that. It is incredibly frustrating to run a state as large as Texas with 140 days of governing every other year. But if something doesn't pass in that session, or if it passes and gets vetoed, as in this bill, then it has to either be brought up in a special or it dies and it waits and it comes back the next odd numbered year. And one of the items that was vetoed as part of this past regular session was a bill that would require schools to provide domestic and dating violence education for middle and high school children in the state of Texas. So all our middle schoolers and high schoolers were going to get evidence-based domestic and dating violence education because young people are at the highest risk of dating violence. The ages of 15 to 24 are at the absolute highest risk. And that bill passed. And it passed with bipartisan support out of both houses, not an enormous amount of bipartisan support, I'll add, but still bipartisan support. And it was vetoed by the governor because he wanted a provision for parents to opt out. So not only do we have no education now required for this kind of education, but it's been put back in as a special session as yet another thing to try to draw the Democrats back in. Across the board, the Democrats in office support this legislation. Almost all of them, if not all of them, voted for it when it first went through the session. And now it's yet another thing that's on this list to try to get them back in. And there's other things on the list, bail reform being among them. And there's plenty of other issues that they can, potentially legislate in within the parameters of the governor's guidelines. But those two really stand out to me as two of the larger things that were supposed to be reasons for us to get through this special session. Is like, here are two pieces of policy that we're going to pass because we have to, because they're important. And here are 9 others that are bad. So kind of trying to bribe folks back, but frankly, not a very persuasive argument when one of the bad things is rampant voter suppression.
It's super interesting. I did read through the list that you sent me of all the different things that were being proposed and going to be discussed. And I did notice that was one of the things. So it was interesting to see the full list in addition to all the election integrity stuff. So specifically on election integrity, how do you think what is happening in Texas may serve as a ripple effect to other states? We know states are passing new legislation on, either, changing their voting access rules and policies. You have other states that are expanding access. So how do you think what's happening in Texas will serve as like a ripple effect to other states?
There's certainly other states that watch. The eyes of Texas are upon us, but so are the eyes of a number of other, certainly conservative-led states, but really everything from watchdog groups to voter rights advocates to folks who were trying to restrict voting access. I think people are watching to see how this goes. So the watchdog groups that I've kind of engaged with are certainly putting Texas at or near the top of their list for the states that are trying to change voter integrity laws and pass voter suppression laws and work on election security, all of those things. And we're seeing some things mirrored in different places, certainly with things like ballot drop boxes. Mail-in voting has just, since 2020, and even earlier than that, has been such a point of contention and has turned into such a partisan tool to argue about election security, even though there's really no solid evidence that any of Texas mail-in voting has been not secure or that has needed an improvement. And that's true of a lot of other states too. I mean, there's so many states that let anyone vote by mail, and we're starting to see challenges to legislation like that, and longstanding traditions in places like Florida, for example, of voting by mail. For heaven's sakes, the president, the past president, thankfully, Donald Trump, voted by mail on more than one occasion in his life. And I'm sure he didn't have any issues with its integrity at the time, but now we're challenging vote by mail across the country. And certainly in these swing states and these right-leaning states are really trying to push the envelope. And I think that's what Texas is best at. Frankly, the way the Republican majority has operated in Texas in my lifetime has been, let's push the envelope and see how far the court system will let us go, see how far we can use our legislative processes to make policy changes and encourage others to do the same. We've seen it on reproductive rights issues. We've seen Texas be, looking at our heartbeat bill, for example, that just passed in the state of Texas, criminalizing abortion and restricting abortion access in Texas has been mirrored in states all across this country. And we often have some of the most restrictive rules about things like reproductive access. And I have no doubts that this election integrity is going to follow really a lot of the same patterns. And especially if it makes it and gets passed, the Democrats are forced to come back and these pieces of legislation get passed, certainly in their current forms, but even in watered down versions, when they become law, if they become law, we'll see other states use that as justification to push the envelope, especially if Texas makes it through lawsuits and those sorts of things. But on kind of the flip side of it, I do think having Texas make such aggressive leaps into these realms opens it up for our advocates, our attorneys, to make really, really strong arguments that this isn't about voter integrity. Texas has had a handful of cases of people making mistakes when voting, in particular, people voting when they can't, but they think they can, looking specifically at folks who are still on probation or are still on parole coming out of the criminal justice system, who have reason to believe that they are allowed to vote, but who haven't completed the process or completed the steps that allow them to do so. Crystal Mason from the DFW area is an excellent example of that. Her case has really, really gotten national attention. There's so many Crystal Masons in the state of Texas who've made just a small error with no deliberate intent to defraud the state or to defraud an election. And Ken Paxton, our attorney general, and Greg Abbott, our governor, are pointing to these folks as examples of systemic problems when they are one person, and looking at those folks and saying, we need to make harder laws in response to errors and treat them as if they were malicious. And legislating like that, I have to believe, is going to come back to haunt them, because a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of the far right, a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out even of some of our more moderate members surrounding this legislation really indicates they're not trying to fix problems. They're trying to make it harder to vote so that the problems never occur.
For sure. And being a native of the DFW Metroplex, as you mentioned there's no shortage of manpower in the state. And 29 million people, we've got the second most populous state in the country we're talking about here. And that leads me to my next question. There's a lot that needs to be done, and there's a lot of people that can do it. We all know that our state is known for being tough. There's a certain grit that people have in our state, and you definitely represent that, a great attitude. And I was going to ask what you recommend for the average person in our state to do and get involved.
Well, thank you. First of all, I feel like there are moments when surrounded by rugged West Texans that I don't always fit the mold, so I appreciate it. The average person, I think the most effective, immediate way is if you live in a district that's represented by one of the folks in DC, call their office and tell them thank you. get engaged with the people who are doing the good as much as you are engaged with the folks who are doing the bad things. So if you are of the opinion that the Democrats in DC are doing the right thing, if you are of the opinion that they are advocating for you and doing their jobs, tell them that. And there are ways that you can donate to support them and their staffs if this Article 10 funding ends. And obviously those are wonderful ways to engage with people. But even on a free capacity, thank yous and calls and emails and all of that, and just Facebook messages to these representatives is a really, really strong way to articulate how much you appreciate the work that they're doing. And the same goes across the board. Whether you are supporting somebody from the left or from the right, regardless of what your partisan affiliation is, your representatives want to hear from you when they're doing something right. I have a pretty positive relationship with my representative, even though he is conservative. He's much more conservative than I am. But when he does something that I agree with, I always tell him every single time, because it's important to me that he knows that we are on the same page more often than not. There's plenty of things, whether it's education issues surrounding domestic violence, issues surrounding services for our youth, all of those sorts of things. Often we are on the same side. And that is great. And we should always tell folks that. And in this moment where there is so much divide, especially if you disagree with your representative on a lot of things, those reaches across the aisle, I think, are really, really beneficial to kind of bring a little bit of sanity and a modicum of decorum, frankly, back to Texas, because there is so much shouting, there is so much blaming, especially around this fight right now. There's so many people who are just enraged at one side or the other, that we could all benefit from a little bit of that. But if you are, like me, represented by somebody who you didn't vote for, then tell them you are unhappy, tell them, and do it politely. Their staff may not agree with them entirely. I have to remind folks all the time that there are plenty of young people who work in these offices who just want exposure to politics, and they may not agree with exactly what their boss is doing. So show a little bit of grace when we reach out to folks, especially when we don't agree with them, but really, really get engaged, and especially heading into this redistricting fight, because it will be a fight across the board. Everybody's going to be advocating for their districts. They're going to be advocating for fairer lines. They're going to be advocating for their political party. And I'm going to be the first to admit that I would love to have districts that skewed left. I understand that there are problems with that, but after years and years of districts that favor the opposition party, I would not complain if I lived in a district that flew my way. So I'm willing to acknowledge the human element of that, but that is going to be something that everyone should care about. And there are going to be hearings in your community. They're going to be online hearings. There's going to be in-person hearings. So find out about those, stay plugged in with your elected officials, get connected with a partisan youth organization nearby, whether it's Young Democrats, Young Republicans, your county party. Obviously, I'm a big advocate of both Young Democrats and county parties, but just getting engaged with the groups that are full of nerds like me who pay attention to all this truly all day, every day. Find out when those hearings are, because you can get your say and you can say, please don't split my county in half. What's important to me is that Ector County is connected to a district that looks like Ector County. And even if that means I'm not necessarily going to be represented by the folks who I'm going to vote for, it's more important for me that like my city doesn't get split in half on racial lines when it comes to this redistricting fight. So get on those calls and ask questions. I mean, truly, there is so much information. It is so overwhelming. I read so many articles. I ask so many questions. I find the people around me who have information. And the best thing that you can do is when you get stuck, not to give up on it, not to write it off as being too complicated. I mean, this series, I think, is so great as a way for folks to find somebody to plug in with, get kind of an idea of what the right questions are, get some keywords to look at. Like this podcast alone, I think, is a great way to kind of plug in and say, okay, now I'm going to go learn more about Article 10. I'm going to go learn more about, whatever topic we talked about today or last week or anything, and just get plugged in with those, because the more questions you ask, it just multiplies every time of how much more information you'll have access to.
Well, thank you for the shout out just now.
Of course.
And being a Democrat in Texas, that takes a lot of courage. You definitely have your work cut out for you.
Amen.
And you've shared a lot of experiences in the hour you've been with us. And we want to end on a good note. So our last question to you is, are you hopeful for the future of our state? And in one sentence, what would your hopeful outcome be?
So you're right. It is hard sometimes to be a Democrat in Texas, but yes, in short, I am hopeful. I come from a deeply Democratic family, despite being from rural Texas. And I would love to see a return to the ticket splitting, candidate researching, community-driven voting that really represents so much of the era of like my parents and my grandparents, of people researching the folks who represent them and their families and their communities, and voting with research and education and their hearts. And I'm a big believer that at the end of the day, that comes out to a lot more Texas Democrats getting elected.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all those experiences. We really appreciate it, and good luck with all your work. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
All right.